Welcome to the Missing Dots podcast. What if the history you've been told on modern pulpits is more political poetry than empirical fact? For centuries, the Battle of Al-Hara in 63 AH has been framed as an apocalyptic, unprovoked massacre, an emotional battlefield of absolute good versus absolute evil. But beneath the layers of post-conquest, abased propaganda, and hyperinflated numbers lies a stark forensic reality of early Islamic statecraft. A severe constitutional crisis, a unilateral break of state allegiance, and an asymmetric urban warfare containment. In today's episode, we execute a complete 180-degree paradigm inversion on the volcanic crisis of Medina. We're stripping away the theological romanticism and the legendary accretions to expose the raw logistical data, tactical terrain gating, and true demographic baselines. This isn't history to make you mourn, this is history to make you think. Let's connect the missing dots.
It really is a profound shift in perspective when you finally lay all these different pieces side by side. We're looking at some incredible research today, and what I really appreciate about it is how it brings together, military historians, experts in classical Islamic law, and demographic researchers.
Yeah, it's not just relying on one emotional story.
Exactly. They aren't trying to push a specific narrative. They're just asking what is physically, legally, and historically verifiable about the year 63 AH. Just separating the raw events from all the legends that sort of ballooned over the century.
And that separation is so needed, because I grew up hearing a very specific, honestly terrifying story about the Battle of Al-Hara.
Most of us did, yeah.
Right. The narrative was always that this godless army from Damascus just descended on the peaceful, holy city of Medina, slaughtered everyone in sight, and committed unspeakable atrocities for days. It sounds like a horror film.
It really does. But the sources we are looking at today ask you, the listener, to put a pause on that emotional reaction. We have to step back and look at the forensic evidence. And to do that, we have to look at the years right before the conflict.
Because the violence didn't just, fall out of the sky one day.
No, not at all. There was a very severe escalating political and economic rupture between the people of Medina and the central Umayyad government, which was up in Damascus.
The economic part is something that almost never gets talked about. But it makes so much sense when you think about human nature.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you have Medina, which for decades was the absolute center of the Islamic world. It was the capital. The wealth of an entire expanding empire flowed right through its streets.
Right, but by 63 AH, the political gravity had completely shifted north to Syria. Damascus is the new capital, so the state stipends the actual physical wealth and resources that families in Medina had grown used to. All of that was being redirected to the Syrian provinces.
Yeah, that has to hurt.
It did. And beyond the stipends, there were these really intense disputes over agricultural land. The central government was basically confiscating state lands around the Hijaz, lands that the locals firmly felt belonged to them.
So you have a population in Medina that feels economically marginalized, politically sidelined, and stripped of their former prestige. That is a very human, very relatable frustration.
It is, but they didn't just write a strongly worded letter to the caliph. The youth and the regional elites of Medina made a massive political move. They formally abrogated their oath of allegiance, the bay'ah, to the caliph, Yazid.
Which, just to be clear, in the context of classical Islamic law, that is crossing a huge line.
It's crossing the Rubicon. Breaking the bay'ah is a total abrogation of the social and state contract. But they actually took it much further than just a verbal declaration.
Yeah, this is the part that completely changed my view of the whole situation. They didn't just verbally say they were out. They took militant action.
They did.
The rebels in Medina literally expelled the Umayyad governor from the city. And then they rounded up about 1,000 Umayyad citizens. We're talking government officials, their families, ordinary civilians. And they placed them under armed house arrest.
Essentially taking 1,000 hostages.
Exactly. And then they start fortifying the city and passing out weapons.
When you look at those specific actions through the lens of fiqh al-buqa, which is the classical Islamic legal framework dealing with armed rebellion, the situation is crystal clear. This was no longer a peaceful protest.
It's way past a civil dispute at that point.
Right. By detaining state officials, holding civilians hostage, and physically fortifying a major city against the state, Medina had formally engaged in an act of armed secession. They had declared themselves an independent, heavily armed state.
I try to think about this in modern terms, just so you listening can really picture the gravity of it. Imagine if a major city today, let's say a former capital city, just unilaterally declared independence, fortified its borders with a local militia, and then rounded up 1,000 federal employees and their families, putting them under armed guard.
No central government in the world is going to ignore that.
Ancient or modern, yeah. A military response is practically guaranteed.
The structural response of the state was inevitable. But even with that armed secession, the Umayyad government didn't immediately launch an assault. This is crucial. The sources reveal that the Syrian commander, a man named Muslim ibn Uqba, arrived with his army at the outskirts of Medina and actually halted.
He didn't just attack right away.
No, he offered the city a 3-day diplomatic amnesty. He gave them 3 full days to lay down their weapons, release the hostages, and restore the political contract without spilling a single drop of blood.
And the rebels aggressively rejected it. They refused the amnesty entirely. So when the Syrian army finally engages, it's not some act of random, bloodthirsty malice against a peaceful town. It is, from a military standpoint, a standard 7th century counterinsurgency operation.
Exactly, aimed at putting down an armed secession after diplomacy had completely failed. That reality completely reorients the story.
It really does.
We are dealing with a severe constitutional crisis that escalated because diplomatic off-ramps were actively destroyed by the rebels. But the complexity, it doesn't stop there. One of the most persistent myths about Al-Hara is that Medina was completely united in this rebellion.
I always assumed that was true. The popular narrative implies that every pious person, all the remaining companions of the Prophet, just stood shoulder to shoulder against the Syrian army.
Yeah, that's the story we all hear. But the historical record shows something totally different. The city was deeply, painfully fractured.
Fractured how?
Well, the narrative of a united righteous resistance shatters when you track the actions of the senior companions and the religious elite. Some of the most highly revered figures alive at the time, people like Abdullah ibn Umar and Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, they strictly refused to break their allegiance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they didn't just quietly abstain, they actively condemned the armed uprising. They warned the youth of Medina that this would lead to disaster.
Wait, they actively condemned the people of Medina for fighting?
Yes, they did. They understood the legal and social ramifications of what the rebels were doing. And perhaps the most striking example of this is the behavior of Zayn al-Abidin, the Prophet's own grandson.
Right.
He maintained strict neutrality during this entire crisis.
SubhanAllah, that detail is incredible to me. And he didn't just stay neutral, right? Yeah. From what I read in the sources, he actually sheltered those expelled Umayyad families in his own home. He provided them safe haven from the Medina rebels.
It is a profound historical moment. I mean, think about the timeline here. This is just a couple of years after the tragedy of Karbala, where his own family suffered terribly. Yet here is Zayn al-Abidin, protecting the families of the Umayyads, his political rivals, because he recognized the danger of the rebel actions.
It shows so much principle.
It does. He, along with those senior companions, prioritized institutional stability. They wanted to avoid fitna, civil war at all costs. They recognized that breaking the state contract and throwing the region into armed conflict would cause far more devastation than, just enduring the flaws of the central government.
That really grounds these historical figures for me. We have this tendency to romanticize early Islamic history, to strip these people of their humanity and pretend they operated on some supernatural, flawless level of consensus.
Right, like they all just agreed on everything instantly.
Exactly. But they were human beings dealing with incredibly complex, real-world politics. You had this localized, factional power struggle driven by the youth and regional ambition, while the elders and the religious scholars were desperately pleading with them to stop.
It demonstrates that the conflict was not a unanimous theological mandate. It was a regional political fracture. But because the warnings of those elders were ignored and the diplomatic amnesty was rejected, the situation moved past the point of no return.
The conflict was going to be settled on the battlefield.
Yes.
So the 3 days of amnesty expire, the Syrian army is outside, the rebel militia is inside. Let's talk about how this battle actually unfolded, because the physical environment, the geography, dictated literally everything. The conflict is called the Battle of Al-Hara. What exactly is a Hara?
A Hara refers to a massive field of basaltic volcanic rock. Large parts of the terrain surrounding Medina are covered in these jagged, sharp, clinkery lava flows. It is an incredibly unforgiving environment.
If you haven't seen volcanic basalt rock up close, just picture walking barefoot on broken glass and jagged razors. It's brutal.
It shreds footwear, it cripples horses, and it makes mass troop formations nearly impossible. You simply cannot march a traditional army across that terrain.
And the rebels in Medina knew their own backyard, so they used this volcanic field to their advantage.
Very effectively at first.
Yeah, they dug extensive defensive trenches across the few narrow, walkable gaps in the rocks. is brilliant defensive engineering. They created a massive bottleneck that completely neutralized the Syrian army's biggest advantage.
Which was their professional cavalry.
Exactly.
It was a very sound tactic. From a military perspective, battles in the late antiquity were largely decided by terrain gating, logistics, and intelligence. The Syrian commander, Muslim ibn Uqba, surveyed the Medinan defenses and realized that ordering a frontal cavalry charge into those trenches would be military suicide.
The bottleneck would funnel his men into an absolute slaughter.
Right, so he looked for an alternative route.
He didn't force a bad hand, he looked for a back door.
And he found one, not through military might, but through intelligence gathering. He exploited existing tribal rivalries inside the city. Through a combination of bribes and political leverage, he managed to get a faction of the Banu Haritha clan to defect.
Wow, so the betrayal came from inside.
Yes, this defection was the turning point. The Banu Haritha allowed a detachment of the Syrian cavalry to slip through a secret, unmapped corridor in the volcanic rock that bypassed the trenches entirely.
So picture this, the Medinan militia is standing at the trenches, facing forward, holding the bottleneck. They think they have the Syrians completely stalled. And suddenly, Syrian cavalry emerges from the volcanic rocks behind them.
They attack the defensive lines from the rear.
It's over at that point.
Completely. Once an army is encircled in enclosed terrain, the psychological impact is immediate. Panic sets in. The defensive lines collapse into a catastrophic rout. The actual combat was over very quickly.
I find it so compelling to look at the battle this way. For centuries, stories have circulated trying to explain this defeat through a supernatural lens, as if the defenders lost because of some divine abandonment. But when you look at the raw data, it was simply military reality.
A tribe defected, a back door was opened, and a professional imperial army executed a classic flanking maneuver. Geography and tactics remove the mystery.
But the collapse of the defensive lines is where the most famous and honestly the most horrifying part of this story begins.
This is where things get really distorted.
Yeah. The trenches fall, the Syrian army enters Medina, and they occupy the city. The traditional narrative claims they sacked the city for 3 days, 72 hours. And the stories say that in those 3 days, the Syrian army slaughtered upwards of 10,000 people.
And it gets worse.
Right. They supposedly violated thousands of women, leading to a whole generation of illegitimate children born 9 months later, known in the folklore as the Children of El-Hara.
This is the exact point where the historical record stops being a military account and mutates into legend. And it is where this research demands that we apply cold, rigorous demographic math to these claims. We have to stress test the folklore against physical reality.
I want to walk through this math slowly, because if you're listening right now, this is where the entire mythical narrative completely unravels. Let's start with the absolute basics. What was the total population of Medina in the year 63 AH?
By analyzing comparative urban metrics for walled oasis cities in the 7th century Hejaz, researchers placed the absolute maximum total population of Medina at between 15,000 and 20,000 people.
And that includes everyone.
Everyone, men, women, children, the elderly, and the enslaved.
Okay, so a maximum of 20,000 people living in the city. Now, how big was the Syrian army that entered?
The estimates for the Syrian force are roughly 6,000 to 12,000 men. And we know from the chronological records that they occupied Medina for exactly 72 hours before they had to break camp and march south toward Mecca for their next campaign.
So you have an army of, let's say, 10,000 men inside a city of 20,000 people for just 3 days. Think about the pure logistics of that. If you've ever been to a major sporting event or tried to navigate a crowded stadium, you know how incredibly slow human beings move en masse.
It takes hours just to leave a parking lot.
Right. So this 7th century army enters a sprawling urban oasis. They have to secure the perimeter, they have to process prisoners, they have to gather supplies, they have to feed and water thousands of horses, they have to feed themselves.
And they have to prepare for a grueling, massive desert march to Mecca right after.
Exactly. The physical bandwidth required just to maintain the army's cohesion during a brief occupation is immense. The idea that this army had the time, the organization, or the physical capacity to systematically hunt down and assault thousands of women or execute 10,000 people, which would be half the city's population, in just 72 hours, while doing all that other logistical work. It doesn't just sound exaggerated, it physically cannot happen.
It is a logistical impossibility. And when the researchers applied demographic and biological modeling to the specific claim regarding the children of Al-Hara, the thousands of illegitimate children, the narrative falls apart even further. It defies human biology.
Because conception is never 100% guaranteed, right?
Nowhere near it. Even when you look at documented, tragic, modern cases of systematic wartime abuse, conception rates in those horrific circumstances peak at around 5 to 8% per incident.
So to get thousands of children.
In order to produce a generation of thousands of children from a 3-day window, you would need a conception rate approaching 100% across thousands of separate incidents. The mathematics of human biology simply do not support the story.
It's demographically impossible. I have to ask then, if the 10,000 number is mathematically absurd, what is the actual verifiable death toll from the Battle of Al-Hara?
When you bypass the later compilations and isolate the earliest, most reliable source materials, the sparse military reports before the stories were inflated, the verified combat casualty baseline is between 180 and 700 named individuals.
Wow.
And these were primarily the young men and the rebel leadership who fought at the trenches, not a random slaughter of civilians.
180 to 700. Look, losing several hundred young men from a community of 20,000 in a single afternoon is a profound tragedy. I don't want to minimize that.
Oh, absolutely. It would be devastating.
It would cause severe trauma to the families in Medina. It was a terrible military loss. But a localized military tragedy of a few hundred combatants is a completely different universe from the apocalyptic annihilation of 10,000 people.
It changes the entire nature of the event. But it naturally leads to a very critical question. If the math proves that these massive atrocities are biologically and logistically impossible, how did a combat death toll of 700 mutate into an accepted historical fact of 10,000?
Yeah, where did these cinematic horror stories actually come from?
To understand the why, you have to look at when these graphic stories were written and who was paying the historians to write them.
Always follow the money.
Exactly. The most extreme graphic accounts, the stories of mass violations, the burning of the mosque, the slaughter of 10,000, they do not appear in the immediate aftermath of the battle. They start appearing in the texts 100 to 200 years later.
That's a huge gap.
It is, and crucially, they are being written under the political patronage of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Ah, the Abbasids. The dynasty that launched a massive, bloody revolution to overthrow the Umayyads.
Precisely the context we need. The Abbasids had an existential political need to completely vilify the Umayyad dynasty they had just destroyed. If you establish a new regime through a violent revolution, you need a negative legitimation strategy.
You have to convince the public that the previous rulers weren't just flawed administrators, they were absolute irredeemable monsters.
Right. So what we're reading in these later texts isn't history at all. It's 8th century wartime propaganda. You take a real event, a tragic civil war battle at Al-Hara, and you stretch the details.
So how does that stretching actually happen? Like, mechanically?
In the field of textual criticism, this phenomenon is referred to as mubalaga, or structural exaggeration. The researchers track this through what they call scribal contamination cascades. It's fascinating to see how it works mechanically.
Walk me through a cascade. How does a simple military report turn into a myth over 2 centuries?
It starts with a sparse, realistic report from the 1st century. An early scribe writes something factual, like the Syrian army breached the trenches, entered Medina, and some plundering occurred.
Very straightforward.
Yes. Then 50 years later, a historian working in the Abbasid court, someone like Abu Miknaf, takes that sentence. He is incentivized by his patrons to make the Umayyads look worse. So some plundering becomes severe plundering.
And he adds flavor to it.
Yes, he adds a specific fictionalized anecdote about an atrocity to heighten the emotional impact.
And then the next guy copies Abu Miknaf's version, right?
Yes, another 50 years pass. The next compiler copies Abu Miknaf's text, but inflates the numbers to make the tragedy seem even more epic. By the time this story reaches the massive encyclopedic compilations 2 centuries later, the original skirmish of 700 casualties has mutated into an apocalyptic massacre of 10,000.
It is literally a multi-generational game of telephone. But instead of being accidental, there is a deliberate political engine driving the exaggeration.
The Abbasid historians engineered these narratives to manipulate public emotion and weaponize the memory of Al-Hara for their own legitimacy.
But here's what I wonder. Did everyone just swallow this propaganda? Where were the rigorous scholars of the time while these myths were being constructed?
The truly rigorous classical Islamic scholars did not accept these stories. And this highlights a method known as quelling critic, or source criticism. Heavyweight classical scholars such as Ibn Kathir and Ibn Taymiyyah actively rejected these extreme fabrications.
Alhamdulillah, that really speaks to the strength of their traditional critical methods.
They scrutinized the chains of transmission and realized the most graphic claims were coming from politically motivated or unreliable storytellers. They didn't let emotion or sectarian grief override their historical methodology.
They explicitly separated the verified tragic events of a medieval military sack from the political folklore.
They understood that personal piety does not give a historian a license to fabricate numbers or rewrite material reality. History is often written by the victors, and these scholars knew how to read between the lines of the official Abbasid chronicles to find the truth.
Pulling all of this together, it is a staggering paradigm shift. We started today with a widely accepted myth, a godless, tyrannical army destroying a perfectly unified holy city for no reason. But the forensic audit shows us a deeply complex human reality.
Very complex.
The Battle of Al-Harra was a genuine tragedy. It was a severe constitutional crisis, and the subsequent plundering of the city, even if brief, was an egregious abuse of state power.
But it was, fundamentally, a human political and military event. It was a localized civil war driven by very real economic grievances, the failure of diplomacy, and the realities of tactical warfare on unforgiving volcanic terrain.
It was not the one-sided supernatural massacre that 8th century propaganda engineered it to be. And if you are listening to this right now, this is why this history matters to you today. This is not just an academic exercise in correcting a ledger from 1400 years ago.
It proves the absolute vital importance of media literacy.
Exactly. It demonstrates why we have to stress test the narratives we are fed, even and perhaps especially the ones wrapped in religious or highly emotional language. We have to separate verifiable historical fact from sectarian or political manipulation.
Because if we fail to do that forensic work, we end up carrying the political baggage and the propaganda of 8th century dynasties into our modern lives, mistaking their political poetry for our history.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to ponder. If one of the most legendary, emotionally charged historical narratives of the early Islamic period can be entirely dismantled just by applying basic logistical facts and demographic math, what other unquestionable historical stories in our modern world might actually be centuries-old political propaganda, just waiting for a forensic audit? To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a tree. May Allah grant us success. Don't forget to get. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.